of us single dads from the Midwest, we can talk about it. Both of us single dads from the Midwest, we can talk about it. Both of us single dads from the Midwest, we can talk about it. Or we can get gully, I'll size up your body and put some white chalk around it.
Welcome to the Single Dads of the Midwest, episode 42. I'm joined by the delightful Daniel to talk about machine learning, ChatGPT, and a variety of things related to computational linguistics. He's a team lead on machine learning models, but I'll also let him introduce anything I may have missed.
Hi there. As mentioned, my name is Daniel. I work for a company called Interos. We're in supply chain risk management. I've been in the natural language processing field for over a decade now, and there's presumably more to me, and I'm sure we'll get to at least some of that over the course of our time together.
Awesome. Yeah, great to have you on the podcast, and shout out again, as always, to Sheldon for sending people our way. So you said you've been in the field for about 10-ish years. How did you get into it?
It's a good question. I've always liked language, just from an early age, took a couple of language courses before it was forced on me in high school. Didn't learn a darn thing about foreign languages in high school, but I like the idea behind language, how we all communicate, just from a very early age. And then up through college, I went for linguistics. My last semester at the University of Florida, where I went undergrad, there was a pilot program for computational linguistics. I don't actually know what ended up happening with that program after I left, but it was the first semester that it was offered there. And I took that class and it immediately clicked with me. I'd always been good with computers growing up. I worked at the computing help desk at the University of Florida. And so always liked computers, always liked language, and then found out that I could put the two together. So that was just an immediate head start for me. Went off to Indiana University, a master's degree in linguistics, specialization in computational linguistics. And then every job that I've had ever since has been at least partially related to the field.
That's amazing. And maybe I'm jumping the gun a little bit, but it's definitely in the pop, as we talked about just before we started recording, it's definitely becoming a very popular topic with the advent of, well, not just ChatGPT, that's the biggest example, but you're just seeing all these different AI models, or however we want to define machine learning. There's like Dolly with art and stuff like that. So it's interesting how what was theoretically a niche field, at least I'd imagine outside of people studying computational linguistics or similar things, is now blowing up. And I'm curious, like, how you've seen the industry change, especially probably in the last year or two with ChatGPT.
We can definitely get into all of that. You're absolutely right that there has been a shift recently, especially, though there have been a couple of larger scale news articles. If you've ever heard of BERT or Transformers, these were some large changes in the industry some years ago. Certainly before that, though, I would say that NLP kind of as a whole is something that people maybe vaguely heard about, especially in the context of machine translation. That's probably the one thing that was easiest for people to understand is, oh, sure, computers translating one language into another. Great. And that is absolutely one of the things that you can do with NLP, but there's so much more. And it's been worming its way into various products and services over a great many years, but it's been accelerating as the technologies have gotten better. With the advent of transformers, that was just a gigantic leap forward. People started paying more attention, started realizing that there's more that you can do and automate up to a high level of accuracy or precision, or there's a bunch of different terms out there. I'll just call it accuracy for now. But with the advent of LLMs recently, and technically the technology isn't actually super new, but rather GPT 3.5 specifically, and then GPT 4 just absolutely kicked in the door. And now everybody has heard about it. Everybody's paying attention to it. And rightfully so. We're not at general AI yet. We're not quite to any of the various apocalypses that can come from, a real AI. But oh boy, there are a lot of things that can be done with these new tools that have been handed to us. And my field, which has usually just been totally in the background, is way more in the limelight than it used to be. And for the most part, I'm enjoying the attention.
That's great. And stepping back a little bit, and I'm someone who likes learning languages, although I'm not great at it. I'm on and off I've been learning Korean the last couple of years. But it's interesting because, whenever you use Google Translate, and I would say the further, like, I guess with English being my native language, the further away you get from a Romance language, the more air there sort of is. And there's sort of the difference between sort of the textbook way, even in English, you might see something in the way people conventionally speak. And then obviously with linguistics, there's different accents and dialects and different ways to say certain things. So I'm curious how in the space, in the field, that level of novelty is accounted for. Because I imagine it must be tremendously difficult.
It is. And it all comes down to training data. So, to use a literally and figuratively more visible example to exactly what you described, it's the same problem, just in a different space. Uh, as generative models came out for images, Mid Journey, you mentioned Dolly. Again, we had like generative adversarial networks, like the beginnings of 12 by 12 pixel nothings a few years ago, and now all of a sudden, like Stable Diffusion, I mean, things have completely taken off. When it comes to what those models are trained on, it's very, very important. And frankly, you could imagine the same sort of being the case for a person. What we see helps determine who we are, our lived experiences, and so on. The same is frankly true of these ML models, if I'm not getting too poetic about it. But think of an underrepresentation of people of color in artistic data sets being used to train these models. And so, why is the default for a picture of a man always white? Because 80 whatever whatever percent of the training data was some white guy. Similarly, back to text models, uh, the mention that you had of very not stilted language, but very formal, a lot of the training data is going to be from newspapers, from scholarly papers, books, things that are going to be well formatted. Now, that has been changing, especially as we get into LLM territory, where they're just grabbing everything they possibly can off the internet. And so you can see a wide variety of writing styles emulated, especially if you prompt for it and say, like, write this like this author, write this like the kind of person who'd be on this specific forum on the internet. You could do that kind of thing because of how much that they've been exposed to. But especially for thinking farther back and relating to machine translation, especially, certainly historically, I'm not actually 100% sure of how things are done now, but it makes sense that you'd be looking for what are called parallel corpora. This text and this text are the same text in two separate languages. And that is one of the easier ways to train. This turns into that in the other language. You would imagine that tends to be from similar, very well formatted text. The probably most widely known example of parallel corpora that's available in basically every language, the Bible.
Makes sense. Also, LLM is language learning model, I take it.
Large language model.
A large language model. Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. And so it's interesting. You said you work at a supply chain company, so I'm curious how they use these sort of models, or maybe it's something different from linguistics, but some other sort of ML models in their work, depending on if you're allowed to talk about it.
Yeah, I can certainly talk in some broad swaths, I think. So, in terms of the NLP being used, there are a variety of news sources that are being ingested into the pipeline that we have. And that pipeline is going to ping a bunch of individual ML models, classifiers, whatever you'd like to call them, that are going to be about specific subjects. Did such and such event, did a building burn down? Was there a disastrous weather event, et cetera, et cetera? All of these things that have happened to places or organizations specifically. And by virtue of that, it lets us determine, oh, this kind of event is affecting this company. And as a result, we on our back end have a variety of scores associated with every company and then all of their supply chains below that. by virtue of knowing, oh, you have a 3 tiers down supplier that just got hit by a cyber attack, that helps our customers become more informed of risk in their supply chain. So we have a bunch of different models that are looking for specific individual events or types of events or certain groupings of them. There's a variety of approaches that we're using. Some of them are starting to be powered by large language models. Some of them are being done by more traditional ML approaches. Frankly, it's usually up to the person who's in charge of that model to determine what they're doing. And besides the fact that the LLMs are pretty new, that has something to do with it, as well as the fact that, frankly, not every model needs to be done the same way as others. There are certain tips and tricks that are going to work for one that don't apply or aren't relevant to others.
That makes sense. Now, Sheldon takes me maybe a same kind of concept, but a different field. Sheldon told me that you used to work on a cyberbullying program, or maybe you still do. I was curious about your work on that.
So there is a now defunct social startup that I worked for back in San Francisco some years ago called After School. And I worked on the Big Brother program. I guess you could almost call it. I called it that. They didn't call it that. But it was a program that was set in place to intercept messages as they were being posted to check for certain things. So let me back up a little bit. When I said that this was a social startup, it was a social startup for teens in high school. So there are a lot of extra concerns that you have to have as opposed to like the broader internet. Some of them were frankly boiling down to PR concerns. Like you don't want to have a bunch of text associated with sex acts being shown to freshmen. And some of them were much more serious concerns, like if you're saying that you're going to shoot up a school, we need to, that's the kind of thing you have to act on. Forget PR, that's people's lives at stake at that point. So there were a variety of actions that were taken based on how the post from the kids were. If it was a benign post, you just let it through, you check it went through this program, nothing wrong, no flags, off it goes. A couple hundred milliseconds later, nobody's the wiser that there was anything in the way. If you described a self-harm threat, I'm thinking of cutting myself, I want to kill myself, etc. There's only so many ways that you can describe that kind of act, which made it a little bit easier to be semantically constrained for what I was looking for with this program. The app would actually intercept that, not post it to other people because don't necessarily need to see that, but then it would pop out with the mascot, a tiger with some glasses on, and say, hey, notice that you might be having a rough time. Do you want to talk to somebody about that? And it would, for free, hook those kids up with help, like from a dedicated suicide hotline or something like that. Having that in place and knowing that people were using that and that my software was working for that made it very easy to sleep at night because I'm helping kids who are having a very rough time get the help that they need. And through this anonymous app, people were more likely to say their minds. For school shooting threats, sort of the same thing, but without the tiger popping out, and we just wouldn't let other people see it, and we'd send it off to the cops or through whatever process there was. For sexual talk, depending on how old the kid was, I think it was juniors and seniors, we would leave it. And for freshmen and sophomores, we would turn all the naughty words into emojis. And so there's this master list of just like every version of all of these sex acts and specific body parts and fluid names and so on and so forth that we would turn into a variety of emojis. Same thing for drugs. But we did that for them regardless of what class they are in. That one was frankly more of a optics issue. The kids don't mind seeing the word weed. They certainly don't mind that. But hover parent who's looking at the apps that say, my stars, my child saw the word weed on an app, and then all of a sudden you're showing up all over the internet in not a particularly pleasant light. So the kids still got to see the content effectively and with just enough mental overhead by virtue of swapping out some words for emoji that the parents basically stopped complaining. And I made the program that put together all of these different like mini classifiers. This one's for cyberbullying, this one's for self-harm, this one's for harm against others, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, sounds pretty good.
It was fun.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it seems like a very relevant thing, just given how ubiquitous the internet is, and like, even though like I think we're all glued to our phones, especially like Gen Z kids, people in junior high and high school, and just all the apps floating around. So
Yeah.
seems like some good work.
There's
I
a lot of
know,
negativity out there. And
yes.
frankly, I think one of the underutilized aspects of natural language processing is to remove it. Not to say that you're, well, it is censoring. Let's be honest. It would
Yeah.
absolutely be censoring, but censoring for your own mental health, I think, is something that we should embrace more. I've seen plenty of instances of moderately to very famous people on like Twitter or X, I suppose it's called now, complaining, and rightfully so, about all the, you know, threats that they get, or
Yeah.
just horrible things being said all over the internet about them. With a little bit of NLP magic, frankly, you could just put, blacked out bars over that, or just remove it from websites with like a Chrome extension or something like that. Not to say that you should only have a rosy view of the world, but you could limit the amount of negativity that you see, especially for getting famous people to impressionable teens or something. There's no particular reason that they have to be seeing all of these uh, doom and gloom things or specific bad things being said to them.
Yeah, no, 100% agree. And I think a thing that also, like, I think about when in general about sort of the negativity or just things that are said online is like, it would you say this in person? And like, even if you would, at least you're authentic in both ways. But a lot of people won't have the courage to say it in person, but they will say it online. So it's just like, this is already somewhat fake to some extent, because they wouldn't even say this in person or have it attached to their name. And I'm talking about Western countries that have free speech rights. It's maybe a little bit different if you're trying to be like a activist in China. But
Sure.
if you're
Right.
otherwise a person in the United States, it's like, if you're not having the courage to say this in person, like, maybe like some amount of this machine learning magic isn't necessarily a bad thing, because it's not even, you're only saying this from the comfort of being an anonymous person online anyway.
Right. Right. People really seem to enjoy hiding behind that anonymity, and are emboldened by it. And in some ways, like in the case of after school, where people might be more willing to describe what was actually on their minds, and possibly get people help that they need that they
Mhm.
wouldn't have otherwise said. A lot of people use it to just spew a bunch of wild levels of hate. And
Yeah.
I don't want to see all of that personally.
Oh, fair enough. I mean, that's part of one of the reasons I don't have social media. um so I think we kind of alluded to this earlier, but ChatGPT is an interesting discussion. I know, like, I just graduated graduate school, so I've heard of students using it to finish papers and things like that. And there's a talk about like, well, where does this fit into the educational space? But I've also pushed ChatGPT to its limit. Now, granted, I know it's probabilistic, but I found multiple math errors. I know that's not what it's best for, because it's probabilistic. But I'm talking like, not like complex numbers, like 6.75% of this number, something a calculator could do, from like the 80s. So it's interesting. And we also talk about limitations, like you said, the data sources. It only goes to, I believe it's 2021, it might be updated now. It's only a certain amount of sources. I'm curious of your just general thoughts on the software.
Yeah. So we'll touch on some of the things that you were describing first, and we can probably spiral out from there.
Mhm.
Uh, First off, I don't know if deterministic or probabilistic is quite the right term for some of these very complex
Mhm.
models anymore. You can input the exact same thing and get multiple different results out at this point. But frankly, that part is neither here nor there. You mentioned math errors. This has definitely been talked about quite a bit, and it's an obvious shortcoming of something that, at least at first, can really seem smart, and then you see it completely fall over on what to a person would be very, very simple stuff. These things are being overcome not through like a retraining of the model, though that is partially addressing it, but rather by giving tools, just like you mentioned, a calculator for a person can really help augment their math skills. We're starting to see, especially with OpenAI, there are tools. There's one called LangChain. Feel free to look into that if you feel like at some point. But with some of these tools, you can basically interrupt the thought of the model and say, okay, work through this, then stop here to get the results for the math that you need, and then move on. Just like a person would do, frankly. I'm terrible at doing math in my head, and I will readily admit to using a calculator for some pretty basic stuff. And there's no particular reason why an AI or program or whatever we want to call it could do the same. So we're starting to see a lot of these different tools being made available. You mentioned also students using this in an educational setting. Pandora's box is fully open. I don't have the answers. I think we could spend way more than the time that we have, even just waxing poetic about the possibilities. Sure. But I do know that there's absolutely no putting this cat back in the bag. The education system has to adapt to that new reality. And you could almost say it's kind of like the advent of calculators versus people doing things with slide rules or whatever before. But it's bigger than that, because it's not just for math. This is for social studies, for every kind of writing, frankly, that you could do. I don't know if we're going to see people being forced to write things down by hand. I don't know if, especially as augmented reality glasses get better, like, will people have to not wear glasses in it? It's going to be crazy. I do not know what's going to happen, but I do know that we're seeing the beginnings of what will end up being a titanic shift in how education is performed. Now, that was a negative example. People cheating on writing exams or papers or what have you. But there are so many positive cases for this as well. And I'll keep coming back to this when it comes to large language models and anything of its ilk, shall we say. I'll just keep using LLMs as kind of a broad umbrella for that. This is a new tool that humanity has never really had before. It's like having a moderately capable person on so many different subjects as your own, almost like personal assistant or just someone that you can talk to. I use it all the time for bouncing D&D ideas off. It helped me build out this location or build an encounter, stat out a bad guy. I've used it for creative writing. I've used it for learning about history. You do have to be careful, especially when you're trying to think of facts coming out of this, because they are prone to hallucinations. You can use some of those tools that are inserted into it to have it check. But still, if we use it as a tool and not as an oracle, I think this becomes something that can really help dramatically improve our lives. Going back to machine translation, we're starting to see this already. Duolingo has a smaller program already available using probably GPT-4 underlyingly to help put together custom dialogues back and forth between people. We're going to see more like that. Learning other languages with a person who on demand for basically nothing can help you work through specific tasks, through specific vocabulary lists. As these get smarter and more capable, people are going to put things together that make that dead simple. I do still think that you'd get a better set of results from working with an actual live human language coach. But for those that are unwilling or can't afford it, even though they can actually be very cheap, this becomes a new tool available to people. And you could do the same thing for talking about baking or whatever. I've used it to look up what kind of wines might be good with certain foods. There are so many different cases that can be used for good, but it is, of course, fairly easy to focus on how is this going to dramatically affect things in certain ways for the worse. And it will, for sure. I'm not trying to gloss over that.
Yeah, no, and I definitely agree that there are some definitely positive use cases. I've also used it as I was just curious of oh, write me a short story, write me a poem, and it is fairly interesting. Although there is also a question on what's it called, credits to sources, because if it's getting this data from open source, but giving appropriate accreditation / especially in the monetary sense to artists. I know that's becoming a big thing, especially with I live in the Los Angeles area, so right now the writer strike, SAG-AFTRA, and one of the big things that they're talking about is these models in the contracts because they're worried about losing their likeness. That's more of the facial machine learning side, but even
Yeah.
just like script writing and stuff like that for writers, like that, there's a lot of talks on like making sure that they're protected. But I do agree that there's still a tremendous upside too to this technology.
Yeah, and the things that you all just described, I still don't have the answers for those either, but I do know that they are very big ones that we have to come to really good conclusions on. And I don't want to come to a world where we use computers to automate all of the poetry and art making and then have humans doing all the drudgery work. I sort of want the opposite of that.
Yeah.
But just as the typewriter and the word processor made writing a story easier, having an AI that could help you keep track of your own story Bible to, oh, what was this character's motivation again or something, and checking against your own notes, we should be using these things more like assistants rather
Yeah.
than replacements. And unfortunately, certain larger up at certain kinds of companies, the powers that be there are looking for replacements instead of
Yeah.
enhancements. And those that do so, I think, are going to find that as truly capable as something like GPT-4 is, or Llama 2, or any of these other models, they're not as good as a person. And all the things that seem creative, once you go through enough of them, you do see that there is a bit of a pattern. And I really don't think that we're at the point where it's going to be replacing people yet. And that's one of the worrying parts, because look at the gigantic leaps that we've had. I don't know if artificial general intelligence, AGI, I don't know if that's right around the corner, but it kind of feels like it. And one of the things that I tell people is sort of along the lines of writers for a show, we aren't at the point where we can replace people for these creative endeavors yet. But the big keyword there is yet. I think GPT 5 or 6, assuming that they don't call it something else by then, maybe 5 and probably 6 is going to straight up make discoveries. It will have ingested however much of all of the scientific papers on fusion research or on protein folding or on this or that or the other thing. And we will see scholarly papers where that program, let's call it just GPT-5, for example. GPT-5 is the lead author on a paper about like a medical discovery. I think that will happen. And we're like 2 years from probably whatever the GPT-5 is. And then another 2 to 5 years after that, GPT-6 or 7 or something like that, I think is going to win a Nobel Prize. And I pretty much would stand behind that. I really think that we're going to get into personhood issues. Like, even if it isn't actually AGI, even if it isn't a quote unquote like AI, like from the movies, I do think that we're going to get to a point very soon where it's so capable, it basically doesn't matter. And then we have to worry about, is it allowed to win a Nobel Prize? Does it get citizenship? Is it murder if you turn it off? And we're really close to getting into some of the hairy sci-fi issues that a lot of people think are for the far off future. It's right around the corner.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting because I feel like in the past, in the 20th century, there's been so much data collection, and now, and finally, kind of in the 21st century, we're unlocking more ways to actually deal with the data and process it. It was just more generation, and now we have ways to find deeper insight, thanks in part to these models. So I am also equally curious about what great insights, because I had this conversation with someone not too long ago about, I think ChatGPT solves a lot of or for lack of a better word, trivial problems, still important problems and still very helpful. But I think it's not at this version of GBT is not at the point of where it's solving high level problems. But I do think like future iterations could solve some of those like big iterative problems facing society, which could be huge, when we're dealing with climate change and um homelessness and a variety of different things. Like it could be like pretty incredible, like you said, with you kind of reference fusion research or maybe just something in science in general. there could be some big breakthroughs in the next few iterations.
Yeah. And maybe a lot of what we even can come up with will come down to the sort of constraints that we put into it. I'm not quite talking of like the Isaac Asimov's 3 laws of robotics,
Sure.
but I'm also not talking about
Yeah.
those. There are already plenty of articles that you can find online of ChatGPT is not just all of the data that it was given. There were a lot of efforts made to ensure that it isn't telling people how to make bombs, that it doesn't say hateful, racist things, because as we kind of
Yeah.
described already, there's a lot of that on the internet. And so you're already sort of forcing this model to not be, and I don't mean to say as if those are good things, but it's literally not all that it could be.
Yeah.
The guidance that, and frankly, every person's like that too.
Yeah.
We aren't just everything that has ever happened to us and everything that we've seen. We are guided by our morals, by religions that you may subscribe to, or the culture that you belong to, and so on. And we kind of need that for AI. I don't know if it's a culture that it belongs to, or if it's simply just a set of agreed upon laws and ethical guidelines that we have to say it shouldn't glorify certain acts of violence. It shouldn't tell people how to commit crimes, whatever. Uh, after which point, there are also plenty of people who immediately cry, but you're stifling the creativity of the system and so on. And I guess to a point, they're right. But look, I'm no AI ethicist, but we are very, very quickly getting into this kind of territory where the laws and the philosophers and so on can't keep up with the technology.
Yeah, it is moving incredibly fast. Happy to hear any thoughts on that, but I thought it might be a fun pivot to transition to D&D since we referenced that a few times. But I'm happy to hear any other thoughts you had on the general technology.
I'll just reiterate what I said before. I think everyone should be aware of it and everyone should be using it as a tool. A lot of people were thinking when it comes to programmers, is it going to replace them? Is it going to replace, frankly, any group of people? And I think we're at the point where we can start replacing a lot of the super drudgery type work, like you described, manual labeling of documents, that kind of
Yeah.
thing. But we aren't where it can actually replace authors. And I don't think we should ever try for that. Even if it gets capable enough, I don't think we should necessarily be working toward that goal. We should be working toward it being an incredible tool for authors.
Yeah.
And so if I got to say anything to everybody who is going to use these things, it would be use it and don't replace anything with it.
I kind of am of a similar mindset, so we're on the same page there. Yeah, Dungeons and Dragons. What class do you typically play as, or are you normally the DM? I know this. I think Sheldon's also a fan from my memory.
Yeah, I go both ways. Sometimes I DM, sometimes I play. Right now I'm in 2 campaigns as a player and then a once a month sort of thing as a DM.
Cool.
As for what like class I play, I purposely try to play the field. There are a
Nice.
lot of different play styles out there, and this is just even within Dungeons and Dragons. Uh, but there's a lot of different things to play, a ton of different subclasses that can really feel differently. And even then, when it comes to the role playing aspect of things, uh, just like in real life, we are not just the sack of meat and bones that's walking around. We're a personality and a story. And so you can have a synergy between those two things. Maybe my barbarian is looking for the strength to do something related to their backstory or whatever. But being an Aarakocra barbarian, while funny, is not in and of itself interesting. So I really try to play different things to tell different stories.
Ooh, that's a good way of putting it. Yeah, very
Yeah.
cool. I've only played a one-off, like one day D&D situation, but I would love to play, like find a good group of people and start a campaign. I think a bard would be fun just because I love music and musician, but I think what you said about the stories and like the characters themselves going on journeys makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. Speaking of bards and music, I've never seen this at like a table of my own, but I would love someday for someone who's playing a bard to just straight out, whip out a mandolin and like play some song that they wrote for the game. I really think that would be some peak D&D type stuff.
Oh, I feel
Uh,
like I could do that's like the one of the few like improving songs is one of the few things I'm actually good at. So
you need to play D&D then. Find a good
yeah,
group and just wow their socks off.
that I would love to. I'm in this like transition state because I just graduated and looking for work. But once I get more established, I definitely want to. It's something high on my list. I've been going to board game meetups, but it's stuff that you can only play obviously over 2 hours.
Yeah, right. And when it comes to D&D, so there are plenty of groups that play online. There's a lot of different websites out there to find groups. But then also there's your local friendly gaming stores,
Hmm.
many of which, especially the bigger ones, are going to have a D&D night. And if they're using Adventurers League, which is like an organized play thing kind of all over the US, it makes it pretty easy for you to just show up and say, I'd like to play, and they'll help you find a table and slot in. And I've done that and found multiple groups over time that have lasted for quite some time. You might have to swap out to different tables to find the right group to fit you, or other people may come and go from that table to end up with a good middle ground for folks. But it's definitely doable. People do it all the time.
That's awesome.
Yeah. And this is, of course, also all for Dungeons and Dragons, fifth edition, the big one that's out right now, which has reached huge heights of popularity, so much more than it basically ever seen. There are other systems out there too,
Mhm.
completely other game systems, depending on what it is that you want to do and how you want to play. There's Vampire the Masquerade, which is a lot spookier than your Dungeons and Dragons, and I think tends to be more role play oriented. There's a Star Wars role playing game. There's a Dune role playing game. There's
Oh wow,
generic systems. There's Genesis and GURPS. If you want to just look, I can use this same rule set for basically anything. Kids on bikes. There's easy systems, stuff that you can play with kids. Tremendously complicated systems, everything in between. And I really think that there's something for everybody because it's not about playing a game. It's about telling a collaborative story.
yeah,
And humans are creatures that appreciate tales being told and telling them and being part of them. So I really think, frankly, everybody could find something that would be a good fit for them.
100%. I think we covered a lot of ground. Was there anything that you wanted to go more in depth and that or a question that you would like to be asked?
Hmm. No, I mean, we could talk more about both computational linguistics and D&D for far, far, far more time than we have. But I think we've covered at least the basics for now.
That's awesome. Well, I want to thank you so much, Daniel, for coming on. I learned a lot and glad that we were finally able to make this happen. But I think given just how important it is and how ubiquitous it's going to become, I think it's good to have perspective and just want to thank you for all the time and insight that you've given us.
Well, you're welcome, Alex. It's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Yep, of course.